Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.63, Arnold's Revenge. As the dust settled in the wake of Guilford Courthouse, both Cornwallis and Greene had to decide what to do next. Greene had lost the battle, but in the process he had inflicted a casualty rate in excess of a quarter of Cornwallis's total force. Meanwhile, the American commander had lost a far more reasonable 7%. More than just the war in the South, however, I want to turn our attention towards the other events going on in other parts of the country. Because the first few months of 1781 were busy. So the plan for this week is to start in the South with the immediate aftermath of Guilford Courthouse, and then move north, getting caught up on just what everybody else was getting into, heading into the spring of 1781. Lord Cornwallis had a serious problem, and he knew it. Sure, he had just been victorious on the field of battle in Guilford, but he was well aware of the actual score. Following a feeble attempt at pursuing the retreating Greene, Cornwallis was forced to face reality. Between Cowpens, the race to Virginia, and now Guilford Courthouse, he had seen his army cut in half. These losses in manpower were always more expensive to the British than they were the Americans, if for no other reason than the practical difficulties for the British when it came to replenishing their men. This had always been the case throughout the entire war. Now, though, things were being exacerbated by the lack of a loyalist militia, which was willing to come out and fight. The entire Southern strategy for the British had been predicated upon all of those loyalists coming out and fighting for their king. We have talked at length about the widely held belief back in London that there was widespread loyalty with plenty of people eager to fight for the British. Of course, the generals on the ground, men like Clinton and Cornwallis, always had their doubts about just how much loyalty there really was. But London remained tone-deaf to these concerns. Sure enough, the number of loyalists that came out and volunteered to fight was already less than the British had hoped for. Following the first 3 months of 1781, that support all but completely evaporated. The depth of this collapsing support really came into focus for Cornwallis following Guilford Courthouse. Making matters worse for the British was that in order to move faster, following the loss of the light infantry after Cowpens, Cornwallis had ordered that the baggage train be burned. By the middle of March, the food situation for Cornwallis was becoming a real problem. Enough so that on the morning of Guilford Courthouse, his men had to skip breakfast. On March 19th, the British reached Cross Creek, a loyal community of Scottish Highlanders. Cornwallis had been hoping that these men would join up and fight, but failing that, at least they would provide the desperately needed supplies. So you can imagine his disappointment when those same Highlanders declined to give any assistance. It isn't even that the Highlanders were not loyal. They still were. The problem was that the ongoing war had taken a large toll on the Carolinas, and that you can't give what you don't have. Cornwallis briefly thought about having his goods shipped to Cross Creek from Wilmington. Unfortunately, though, America's irregulars controlled too much of the river to safely transport the goods. With no other choice, Cornwallis was forced to move his exhausted army to Wilmington, where he arrived on April 7th. The British were not exactly feeling great about anything at all by this point. The past few months had been disastrously bad, and had left Cornwallis believing that his chances of a definitive battle to crush Greene was probably now out of the question. Certainly he had hoped that Guilford Courthouse would have been just that, but in the end it had been anything but a decisive blow. Now, it is also worth noting that throughout the month of April, Cornwallis was increasingly watching his control over the Carolinas slip away. We're going to talk more about that in just a moment. Ultimately, what Cornwallis decided is that the Carolinas were a lost cause, at least for the time being. His eyes shifted up to the north, where our old friend, and now mortal enemy, Benedict Arnold was wreaking havoc on Virginia, something that we are also going to talk about a little bit later today. In a letter to Clinton, Cornwallis shared his beliefs that he thought that the best thing for the British was to cut their losses in the North entirely, abandon New York, and focus the war solely on securing Virginia, and, more specifically, the Chesapeake. He hoped that the combined armies would be able to draw the Americans into that mystical battle, where they could finally deliver that knockout blow and swiftly end the war, recovering their colonies. Pragmatically, Cornwallis had several reasons for wanting to take the war effort to the north. He was sick to death of the Carolinas. Heading back to South Carolina seemed like an awful idea, considering that he would likely find himself in another cat-and-mouse chase with Greene, in a country that the Americans were quickly recapturing, where there were ample opportunities for Greene to trap Cornwallis up against a river and destroy his entire army. Furthermore, Cornwallis absolutely hated the idea of moving backwards, much as Burgoyne had years earlier as he approached Saratoga. Retrograde movements were not positively viewed. Virginia brought with it multiple benefits as well. First, unlike the Carolinas, there were several navigable rivers that made the logistics of keeping the army supplied that much easier. Likewise, there was at least a chance that if Cornwallis could get control over Virginia, he could cut off supplies to the south and allow the Americans to slowly exhaust their ability to resist British recapture. Finally, Cornwallis was well aware of just how many men he had lost so far in 1781. In Virginia, there were 3,600 troops under the command of the recently arrived William Phillips. Cornwallis's arrival would bring that number to a far more respectable 5,000. All of this was enough to sell Cornwallis on the idea that the grass was indeed greener in Virginia, and on April 27th, he set out to Petersburg, Virginia. As Cornwallis was licking his wounds, Greene was becoming increasingly pleased about the outcome of Guilford. Now, though, he too needed to figure out what his next move was going to be. Greene, seemingly aware now of what the real score at Guilford Courthouse had actually been, was pursuing Cornwallis, but was not exactly doing so aggressively. Greene himself was not in an ideal position to pick a fight, as his own supplies were running low, and at the end of March, much of that militia that had supported him packed up to head home. With his own forces down to around 1,500 total men, Greene broke off his pursuit and moved towards Camden, South Carolina. As Greene made his way back towards the south, it begs the question of why? What was he hoping to find? The answer to this seems to be that he may have wanted Cornwallis to take up his role of chasing Greene throughout the state again. You know, the exact thing that Cornwallis now intended to avoid by abandoning the Carolinas and heading north to Virginia. If Greene could get Cornwallis to give chase, it opened up the possibility that he would be able to trap the British general with his back against one of those many rivers, and himself deliver a knockout blow. Even here, though, there is some debate over whether or not Greene really believed that Cornwallis would give chase. Had he done so, that would have required Cornwallis to give up control over North Carolina, which Greene doubted that he really wanted to do. In the event that Cornwallis did give chase, well, then Greene's plan for a knockout blow at least survived, assuming that he could get assistance from those backcountry fighters, with men like Marion, Pickens, and Sumter still slugging it out in South Carolina. If Cornwallis declined to give chase, then Greene would have to concentrate on clearing out the British presence in South Carolina. Okay, so we know why South Carolina. But why specifically was Greene moving towards Camden? The answer to that question is that Lord Rawdon was there with some 900 men, a mixture of British regulars and militia. The last thing that Nathanael Greene wanted was for Cornwallis and Rawdon to combine their forces. The plan, therefore, was for a large-scale attack on British holdings in South Carolina. Our backcountry leaders, Pickens, Marion, and Sumter, were going to take care of those British garrisons throughout the state, while Greene took care of Rawdon. By late April, the Americans were having success at removing the British garrisons through the new use of a tactic for assaulting fortified locations called the Mayhem Tower. These were quickly constructed towers that would allow an assaulting army to climb up and fire directly into a fortified location. Think of it kind of like a highly exposed sniper's nest. It was far from elegant, but as it turns out, it worked pretty well at allowing the Americans to pick off the defenders of these British garrisons. With the British control over these southern holdings weakening anyway, slowly but surely, British control over the backcountry of South Carolina began to collapse. While the other attacks from those backcountry fighters were finding success, it was Greene and Camden who would find things to be a bit more difficult. The battle came on April 21st on Hobkirk's Hill, located just to the north of Camden. Briefly, Greene believed that he would be able to outflank the army on both the left and the right and completely envelop it. With both flanks under attack, Greene turned towards William Washington and his cavalry to come around the back and completely surround Rawdon. This plan ended up failing for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, Rawdon quickly figured out that his flanks were in danger. He had 3 regiments in reserve, and as soon as he understood his problem, he called those reserves up to the front to protect his flanks. Meanwhile, Washington was not exactly moving at a breakneck speed, and wasted far too much time dealing with non-combatants behind British lines. This slow approach meant that the British rear remained largely untouched, and with a clear path of retreat remaining available. In some ways, the battle mirrored the First Battle of Camden from the previous year. This time it was the Maryland militia, located on the American left, which began a hasty and confused retreat. Somewhat amazingly, the regiment's commander, John Gumby, was able to stop the retreat and somewhat begin the process of reforming his lines. However, it was already pretty much over at that point. With the sudden and panicked retreat of the Marylanders, the rest of the line's cohesion faltered. The British advanced with bayonets, causing even more confusion, and suddenly the Americans found themselves playing defense. It was that loss of cohesion that opened up the American lines and allowed the British to pour through. Any hopes that Greene had of securing an unambiguous victory vanished, and the Americans quickly began pulling back. For Greene, the retreat was, more or less, orderly. Or, rather, I suppose I should say that it did not descend into a completely pell-mell rush to safety, like during the First Battle of Camden. With Greene's personal help, the Americans were also able to save the artillery. Showing up a bit later than desired, Washington did engage the British rear, causing damage, but at that point victory had already escaped the Americans' grasp. A thoroughly annoyed Nathanael Greene pointed the finger at anybody he could after the fact. At the end of the day, though, the loss at Hobkirk's Hill had not been the devastating blow that the loss of Camden had been a year before. Although losing the battle, a battle that he really did think he was going to win, stung Greene, he did have a few things going for him. Both sides had taken some heavy casualties during the battle. With the British having such a difficult time replenishing their numbers at this point, these were hardly losses that they could afford to take. Despite their victory, the time for the British in the Carolinas was coming to an end. The Americans were recapturing British-held positions all throughout the Carolinas. Greene was unhappy with Sumner and Marion for not backing him up at Camden. However, it was their actions throughout the Carolinas that really would push the British out of the region altogether. Rawdon, despite his desire to destroy Greene, quickly recognized that he lacked the manpower and support to pull off any last-minute miracle. By May 24th, he had abandoned Camden. Although the fighting in the Carolinas was not quite at an end yet, by this point the writing was on the wall. By the beginning of the summer, the British were abandoning their positions throughout the Carolinas. This is not to say that these holdings were just giving up without a fight, though. The defenders at 96, the last major British fort in the Carolina backcountry, actually did manage to hold out against the American siege. Eventually, the Americans were forced to break it off to avoid a general engagement with Rawdon. However, much to the likely chagrin of the men, the battle was already over. Rawdon relieved the men and broke off the siege, only to order that 96 be abandoned. Just like that, the Americans were now in full control over the Carolina backcountry. Earlier in the same month, it was Light Horse Harry Lee who had forced the British to surrender Fort Cornwallis in Augusta, Georgia. Per historian Woody Holton, this restored an American hold on Georgia and very likely eliminated any meaningful claim to the state that the British would have in the future peace talks. By July, the only British holdings south of Virginia were Charleston and Savannah. With the war in the Carolinas now wrapping up, the epicenter of the conflict would shift towards the north. It was in Virginia that Cornwallis hoped that he could deliver that final crushing blow, which would defeat the American rabble once and for all. It may feel somewhat strange that we have not really talked much about Virginia in what seems like a really long time. Virginia was the economic engine that ran the states, as it was by a good amount the largest both in terms of population and economic might. Virginia had likewise shown off early on that it too could have a radical side. Patrick Henry says hello. In the present war, however, Virginia had to this point found itself mostly spared. Part of the reason for this largely just came down to logistics. Initially, the thrust of the British was to move south, an action that saw them fighting throughout Pennsylvania. When that largely petered out, the strategy once again shifted, and we get the southern strategy that we have been talking about for the last several months emerging. Caught in the middle of all of this was the largely untouched state of Virginia. Times were indeed changing, however. As we have been talking about for the last few episodes, today included, the British had more or less lost the war in the Carolinas. Cornwallis had given up trying to hold the Carolinas and was now moving north towards Virginia, while encouraging Clinton to move men from New York for an attack on the state. It seems that following Camden, Rawdon had reached a similar conclusion, and he too was moving north, despite his victory at Hobkirk Hill. Now, Virginia had not totally been forgotten about during the British Southern strategy. At the beginning of 1781, Henry Clinton was determined to disrupt the flow of supplies into the Carolinas. This is all going on prior to either Cowpens or Guilford Courthouse, so Clinton's frustration with the situation in the South at this point was generally much more in response to those backcountry fighters, as well as from the American victory at Kings Mountain. Regardless, though, the situation was clear. If he could occupy Virginia, it would cut off supplies to the South and would basically starve those pesky southern states into submission. As we are doing a bit of backtracking here already, I think it probably should be noted that this is pretty much the same plan that Cornwallis had at the end of April, which probably should tell you how things had been going. The task of securing Virginia was given to a brand new British officer, our old, now disgraced friend, Benedict Arnold. Upon his arrival in Richmond on January 5, 1781, Arnold quickly got to work. Part of this work included linking up with several hundred escaped slaves who were eager to fight for their freedom. The British offer of emancipation in exchange for participation in the fighting was sufficient enough enticement for many to join up. Among these enslaved men and women who were now choosing to fight were slaves that had formerly been the property of both George Washington as well as current Virginia Governor Thomas Jefferson. Arnold's arrival in Virginia very nearly spelled disaster for Thomas Jefferson, who found himself narrowly avoiding capture. Jefferson's time as the Virginia governor had been anything but a high water mark for him. He certainly was not out there commanding troops. Nobody is going to confuse Thomas Jefferson as the guy actually leading the fighting. However, in this instance, Jefferson's actions seemed to fall short of even somebody who had never been a military guy. As Arnold landed in Richmond, Jefferson seems to have blown off their arrival as mere rumors. Now, in his defense, such rumors of British landings were not exactly abnormal, and to date they had always proven to be false. This time, however, Jefferson allowed critical days to pass, while Arnold was able to start moving about with near impunity. By the time that Jefferson realized that this was not a rumor and that the British were indeed present, Arnold had already begun shelling Richmond. Jefferson himself was slow to leave and very nearly was captured by the British. Jefferson would be criticized long into the future for his behavior during this period. His political opponents were not about to let people forget that Jefferson had acted like a coward when he had gone running away from the British. When running for the presidency, this was a fantastic way to get across the point that Jefferson is the kind of guy that simply can't handle the pressure. Jefferson biographer Dumas Malone criticizes the treatment that Jefferson would receive afterwards from his rivals, more or less arguing that it was overblown. Malone openly writes that Jefferson received an unmerited degree of censure following the affair. Although, while we can debate whether or not Jefferson was fairly treated following Arnold's invasion, it probably does need to be stated that Dumas Malone does tend to be pretty sympathetic towards Jefferson. And honestly, that is putting it very, very mildly. I will not be the one to deny Jefferson's actions towards the approaching British were less than ideal. However, I think we must also consider the alternative. What else was he supposed to do? Calling out the militia faster would have been great, but we really don't know if that would have accomplished anything. We have seen the militia turn and run many, many times so far during this war. Had Jefferson decided to stay and fight, he would have been risking capture, which from a political point of view, would have been an absolutely devastating blow to the American cause. Jefferson had been the author of the Declaration of Independence. The very last thing that the Americans needed was the spectacle of the author of the most critical document in the war falling into British custody. If fleeing was bad, capture was surely worse. Now, we are going to leave Virginia here for right now. We are going to return next time to move that story ahead, as the Old Dominion would quickly become the center of the war. But to wrap up for today, I want to head up to the north to check in on Washington's army and see what they were up to, as well as to see what our friends in Congress were working on. Washington had a rough start to the year. He was in command of an army that had not seen much in the way of action for a prolonged period. Making matters worse, a lack of supplies and poor pay had left him busy trying to control the mutinies breaking out along his lines. It is unsurprising, therefore, that Washington found himself to be in a particularly dour mood throughout the beginning of 1781. It likewise probably did not help that as Washington was dealing with mutinies breaking out, he was learning that his former friend, Benedict Arnold, was busy invading Virginia. If there is any lingering doubt as to Washington's feelings towards his former friend, he would write to Lafayette on February 20th that should Lafayette capture Arnold, he was to waste no time summarily executing him. If you are wondering what Lafayette was up to in Virginia, well, tune back in next time and we're going to talk more about that. In response to the British invasion of Virginia, it seems that initially, Washington may have underestimated the risk. Washington wrote to Jefferson on February the 6th that he believed Arnold to merely be diversionary to the main British thrust under Cornwallis, a method whereby he could tie the Virginians up and prevent them from sending troops to the south to reinforce Greene. It seemed that it would take an act of nature to change Washington's view. Luckily, in that same letter where he assures Jefferson that Arnold is just meant to be a diversion, he makes mention that a powerful storm had swept through Rhode Island. He would learn shortly thereafter that, as luck would have it, the British fleet in Rhode Island that was busy blockading the French fleet in Newport had taken significant damage. The French fleet, on the other hand, was left pretty much completely unharmed. Quickly, Washington began making plans on sending a French fleet south to the Chesapeake to deliver his own devastating blow. He wrote to Rochambeau about this sudden opportunity, trying to nudge his French ally into a decisive action. With Washington suddenly trying to sell an attack via the Chesapeake, it meant that Virginia now took on a new importance to him that was absent just a few weeks earlier. As Washington sat crossing his fingers for a major French naval action in the South, in Philadelphia, the Congress finally managed to get the Articles of Confederation up and running. The Articles of Confederation had been hanging out, unratified, since way back in 1777. As we had discussed way back in episode 4.37, the Articles had largely been held up by those previously existing rivalries, those rivalries that predated the American Revolution. If the Declaration of Independence had required a united front and unanimity between the states, the Articles of Confederation had become the exact opposite, existing for years in a state of limbo. So the obvious question becomes, what exactly changed in early 1781 to finally get everybody off of the fence? Part of what made the Articles of Confederation so difficult was the requirement for unanimous acceptance. There was very little that the states did that was unanimous. Recall the pulling of the teeth that was involved in getting everybody on board with the Declaration of Independence? Sure enough, when the calendar turned over to 1781, the Articles found themselves being held up by a single state, Maryland, over a single issue, Western land claims. Now, you could probably do an entire podcast on the complete insanity that was the land claims in the colonial United States. We have talked before about the extent of these claims and how they were often overlapping with other colonial holdings. Although it seems a bit crazy for us today, for the states at the time it was anything but crazy. These land claims held very real value that, if the objective is self-interest, nobody was itching to give up. Maryland's gripe was ostensibly that they wanted the federal government to control claims over the Western lands, because it would help pay for the war debt. Historian Woody Holton, however, expands on this, saying that the real goal of the Marylanders was the idea that speculators from outside of Virginia would get better treatment from Congress than they would from Virginia. In other words, Maryland wanted to do away with the home team advantage that Virginia was exercising over their Western lands. Unsurprisingly, Virginia was no more interested in giving up their claims than Maryland was in allowing them to remain. Ironically, it was none other than Benedict Arnold who, albeit indirectly, would convince the Virginians that in light of Arnold's arrival, maybe it was a good time to give up the fight. A few weeks later, now with their final grievance being out of the way, Maryland signed on the dotted line, and the Articles of Confederation became the official governing document of the United States. There is so much that can, and should, be said about the Articles of Confederation. I don't think that it is much of a spoiler to say that the Articles were, basically from their inception, a dumpster fire. At the moment, the leadership appeared to be happy about it. Washington wrote to John Sullivan about his pleasure that an agreement could be reached. He would write on February 14th to John Matthews, commenting that he hoped, with an official government now in place, it would allow Congress to speak with more authority over the question of requisitions from the individual states. Now, as we are going to see, the Articles are going to prove to be weak to the point that Congress was not going to be able to get much of anything done. Really, it left all of the power in the hands of the individual states. We are going to spend the beginning of our next season talking at length about the failings of the Articles of Confederation and just what exactly it meant for the young Union. Now, before we wrap things up for today, I want to give you all an idea of where the show is going for the remainder of this season. Because believe it or not, we are quickly approaching the end of the 4th season of this podcast. I have decided that the season will conclude with the Battle of Yorktown. Yeah, I know the war is going to continue on for a few more years. But really, after Yorktown, it is pretty much over. It is in the aftermath of Yorktown that Congress is going to have to begin answering that always critical question. The question of, what do we do next? Heading into 1782, it feels more like a discussion of the early republic than it does the ongoing war. Plus, come on, we just finished our 63rd episode of the season. It is time to move on. Next time, we are going to pick back up with our story as all the parties involved are going to have to decide where to bring the fight. Will it be in New York? Virginia? Somewhere else altogether? Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as everybody plans for the summer of 1781.